Morning, everybody. Thank you very much for joining us here for this panel on polling. I'm very pleased to be joined here up on the stage by some of the most influential American pollsters that you could find and opinion makers that you could find. These are the people that campaigns turn to every 4 years to tell them what the electorate is thinking here in America. And we're very lucky to have them with us here this morning. On my right is Stanley Greenberg. He's the president and CEO of Greenberg, Quinlan, Rosner Research. Stan has served as a polling advisor to presidents and prime ministers, to CEOs, and to dozens of tough campaigns here in the United States and also around the world. He's worked on campaigns including those of President Bill Clinton, Vice President Al Gore, British Prime Minister Tony Blair, President Nelson Mandela, and leaders in Israel, Europe, and Latin America. Stan's new book with James Carville, It's the Middle Class, Stupid, is a spirited and serious appeal to the country to put the middle class at the center of politics, and of course, it's a big topic of debate during this election campaign here in America, and Stan will speak about that book in just a minute. To Stan's right is Whit. He's the president of North Star Opinion Research. He's also a member of the political science faculty at the University of South Carolina. He's the co-founder of Resurgent Republic, which develops and disseminates creative conservative messages for the 21st century and conducts surveys and focus groups as well. He was honored as the Republican Pollster of the Year by the American Association of Political Consultants in 2012. To Whit's right is John Cohen. He is the director of polling, and he's the polling editor at the Washington Post newspaper. John's responsible for conceptualizing and analyzing all of the Washington Post polls, and he writes about those polls and his analysis of those polls for the Post as well. He also, on election night itself, crunches all of those exit poll numbers. John is here very kindly. He's stepping in at the last minute for Andy Kohert of the Pew Research Center because Andy, unfortunately, is not well and couldn't make it, but John has very kindly filled in for him instead. At the end, we have Peter Hart. He's the chairman of Hart Research Associates. He's directed Peter Hart Research Associates, which has conducted 8,000 public opinion surveys, 8,000, and has interviewed more than 6 million individuals, a huge resource for us here this morning, as well as for the country, of course. He's also undertaken more than 6,000 focus group sessions, and it's one of those focus group sessions that Peter is going to speak to us about this morning. Peter. Take it away.
Great, thank you very much. I'm delighted to be here. Can I ask for the house lights to go up? Can the house lights go up? I don't know if that, great. Good morning, everybody. I'm Peter Hart, and I've got to tell you that my whole thing is I like to be able to look and to understand public opinion polls. First of all, I've got to find out, do we have a new age audience or an old age audience? So everybody up, everybody stand up. Up, 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 up. There you go. That's the aerobics part of this. Okay, here's how it works. If you answer yes to a question, you have to sit down. Now, I look and I see a lot of young people right in the front. I think they're going to be standing at the end. We'll see about the rest. First of all, do you wear a wristwatch? If the answer is yes.
Wow.
Okay, we still got 3 questions to go. Will we have more than 10 standing? Number 2, do you have a landline phone? Number 3, do you read a printed newspaper? You're still standing, you're there, my youth crowd. Okay, last question. Do you use your cell phone more as a phone than to text? More as a phone than to text. How many people we've got left standing? How many of you are over the age of 30? Hey, we have about 3 people. Well, we know the crowd now. We'll go from there. What I want to do is just set the mood a little bit with with my great colleagues here, and give you a sense of something. We do an awful lot of polling, all 4 of us, But the fact of the matter is we also do something called focus groups. And what I'm going to do is try and explain a little bit about how polling and focus groups relate to one another. And let me set the mood, if I could, and just talk about the landscape and where we are as a country. And as all of us would tell you, when you ask Americans about where things are headed headed in the right direction or seriously off on the wrong track, you essentially get by about a 2-to-1 margin, Americans say things are seriously off on the wrong track. When you ask the American public about the economy and how things are going in terms of the economy, the same thing. There's more negative than positive in terms of where things are at. If you look, and the third thing you ask the American public is, this is the key, I don't want to do something too quickly, about confidence in terms of institutions, whether it is the media that John's with, or whether it is the Congress, or whether it is any institutions ranging from our doctor, our lawyer, to our bankers. All of those things we used to believe in, all of those things we used to say we can count on. At this stage of the game, our confidence in every institution is down. More importantly, when you look at this, where's America's place in the world? We ask a question, and I do the NBC Wall Street Journal poll, which I do with Bill McIntyre, the Republican pollster. When you ask the American public, as we did 15 years ago, who would be the strongest economic power some generation from now? By a margin of 54 to 3%, the American public said it would be the United States, 3% said China. Today, it's even at about 40% for each. It is that uncertainty. And then finally, the most important, and one of the points that Mitt Romney made in his acceptance speech, and that is we now have more people thinking the next generation will be worse off. Basically, what we've had is 13 generations where we've always handed the baton forward. This is the first time we believe that Americans are going to hand the baton backward. Those are the forces which really set up the 2012 election. And if you're talking about where things stand, essentially what you would know is that for a Democrat, for an incumbent, it's a challenging re-election period. If you look at this and go from there, what it really comes down to is what we call economic confidence. And that's always provided the sense of where we're at. And the University of Michigan Survey Research Center has always measured confidence over the past 50 to 60 years. And we know that when the public is at 85 or above, it's a good sign for an incumbent. So if you go back and you look at Jimmy Carter, when he was running for re-election, it never even got close to 85. He was wiped out by Ronald Reagan. If you look, Reagan played above the line, essentially. Everything was, quote, morning in America, more positive. If you look at Bush, H.W. Bush, Bush 41, essentially what you see is only in the very end of the campaign did America start to gain economic confidence. But we were in a different era. There were no blogs. There were no quick overnight kinds of programs that gave you a sense of where things were at and everything else. So things got frozen much more earlier in the campaign. Finally, you look at Clinton. Clinton played above the line all of the campaign, essentially, for his re-election. And W. Bush 43, again, above the line in the end, very close campaign. And the challenge here is if you look at the line for President Obama, at this stage of the game, it's well below 85. The challenge here is how much and how close does it get to 85? But what's different, and you've heard it talked about at this stage of the game, is the Friday numbers. Friday numbers are going to come out this week. They're also going to come out right before the election. So America's going to be playing right to the end in terms of how I feel about the economy and where things are at. All of these things sort of set up where this election is. And I'm telling you what Americans think. I want to also tell you what we do an awful lot of is the focus groups. And in this stage of the game, what we want to know is not only what people think, but what they're feeling. And if we could go to this. Here we go, Diane.
Rain.
Fog.
Tsunami.
Tides. Overcast.
Earthquake.
Cloudy and overcast.
Thunderclouds rolling in.
Overcast with threatening storms.
Stormy.
Stormy.
Fog cloud.
I worked at Harley Davidson. I got laid off in 2009 and had a heck of a time finding a job, and it's not nice out there. When you're without a job, it's just not nice out there. And that gave me a whole different perspective. I've never, you know, since I've been 18 in the working world, never have I looked at life like I do today.
And how's that affected your thinking politically?
I don't really pay attention to it. And I know in 2008 when I was still working, and Obama was running, it was big. You know, I was real into it. This year, I'm not really into it. I just have a feeling that no matter what happens, it's not going to change.
If you look at this is a woman named Michelle, who is in her 30s, essentially laid off from Harley Davidson. And what is fascinating as you look at it, it's what's going on inside. And I can tell you that she is probably as good a quintessential voter in America, a suburban white woman looking at this election, voted for Obama in 2008, looking at it in 2012. She's trying to figure out where she's at. So you hear all her angst about the economy, her uncertainty, and the sense of the sacrifices and the changes. And Whit and I were talking backstage, and we both do focus groups, and essentially, in this group, 10 out of 12 people had been somehow affected by the recession. That is either a foreclosure, a loss of job, somebody in their immediate family had been hurt in some way. So this is an exceptionally personal, a personal situation. And given all of this, what we really find out is what we're looking for in a focus group is not only do they check a box, excellent, good, fair, or poor, but what's going on in the pit of their stomach. And for Barack Obama and for the Democrats, and I'm the Democratic pollster, I tell you it's a challenge. And if that were the whole election, as Mitt Romney would like to put it together, that would be one thing. But there's so much else that goes on in terms of an election. One element is enthusiasm. How much interest, how much enthusiasm. And the two numbers to read here are really young people and Hispanics. Those were two exceptionally important groups in terms of the 2008 coalition. They are going to be vital for Obama in 2012. The challenge here is how do you start to turn them around? How do you start to get them involved? And at this stage of the game, you can see their involvement is significantly below where it was. They may be late deciders. They may be people who only get enthused out of this convention and then the things that are happening. But I can tell you, whether you look at North Carolina, whether you look at Iowa, Wisconsin, New Mexico, Colorado, Nevada, all of these states, if the turnout is not up with those groups, the challenge to the president is great. So you look at this, and it all says to you, well, then it must be Romney. Romney must be the favorite. Well, here's the problem. If you look at this, there we go. And when you ask the American public who's in the mainstream and out of the mainstream, and this is from our NBC Wall Street Journal poll, essentially 54% of the American public see Barack Obama as part of the mainstream. It was what Michelle Obama did yesterday and how well she framed and set up the situation. And it's the problem facing the challenger. At this stage of the game, only 44% see him in the mainstream, 51% do not. And what it really comes down to is, in our elections, it's not only what's going on in the head, it's not only what's going in the pocketbook, but it's what's going on in the heart and what's going on in the stomach. And if you look at this, what it really comes down to is, for the American public, we have such a thing as a gut check. And a lot of the questions that I like to ask really basically go at this, try to understand what people are thinking, where they're coming from. I mean, one of the questions that I ask is, if you had a choice to go to a ball game, who would you choose, Barack Obama or Mitt Romney? I'll ask this crowd. Okay, how many would choose Barack Obama to go to a ball game with? How many would choose Mitt Romney? I'm sure there's someone out there. What I got in my focus group is that 9 people said, I'll take Barack Obama. Easy to talk to, enjoyable, knows the game, would be good company, etc. But 3 people said Mitt Romney. So I turned to them and said, why? They said, we'd have the limo, he would pay for the brew, he would pay for the hot dogs, etc., etc. So they didn't want to really be there. I asked another question. I said, let's suppose that we were all lost in a forest and Mitt Romney were there as your leader. What would happen? They said he would go and get a fancy GPS system to help us out, or he would phone Donald Trump, okay? Again, no sense of bringing the group together, working with people, the sense of what's there. Ask another question, and I said, what would Mitt Romney be like as your next-door neighbor? And what would Barack Obama be like as your next-door neighbor? Listen to him.
Okay, okay, good. Barack Obama's your next-door neighbor. Tell me what Barack Obama's like. What's he like, next-door neighbor? Okay, so what would he be like, Sandra?
I think very fun and very friendly.
Nicole, Michelle, Nicole.
I think he would make an effort to be neighborly.
Yeah, how would he be, Michelle?
I think so too. I think he would take my boys in. My boys are loud outside, you know, and it takes good neighbors next door to put up with them.
Okay.
I think he'd be fine with it, you know.
Yep, Susie.
I think he'd be down to earth, the kind of neighbor that would be playing outside with his kids.
Okay, Claudia.
I don't think he would be friendly.
Okay, Linda.
I think he would be friendly. He'd bring a little vegetable tray and
A little vegetable.
come on over.
From Michelle. Okay,
My wife told me to bring this.
Yeah, okay, anybody else?
We'd probably exchange things from the gardens.
Get this sense of how comfortable, the warmth, and everything else. Let's take the
Your
same
next-door
question.
neighbor's Mitt Romney. Tell me about your next-door neighbor, Susie.
I guess he just kind of seems a little bit snobbish, so I would feel uncomfortable around him.
Okay, tell me about your next-door neighbor, Michelle.
I probably wouldn't feel like I was good enough for him.
Tell me about your next-door neighbor, Pam.
And he's got some cool elevator for his cars and there's multiple Cadillacs apparently, so he's got way more than I have.
Tell me about your next-door neighbor, Donna.
I don't think I'd be able to associate with him at all.
What about Linda?
My house is lower than his, so he probably won't talk to us.
Claudia, tell me about your
I
next-door
think
neighbor.
we'd have barbecues together. I
Okay.
think he'd come over and bring steaks.
The whole sense of the gap. And that's what's so important. And if you look and you just compare what Ann Romney did in her speech a week ago and what Michelle Obama did in her speech last night, and the difference between them and what happens. And that's so important because so much of it really comes down to how do I feel and where am I coming to? And let me conclude with one final issue that nobody's talked about, but I think is so central and so important, and that is Mitt Romney releasing his taxes. And what I have here is essentially a dialogue. 2 women, both undecided. One was the Michelle that you remember who's been laid off, and listen to what she's going through and where she's at, and then listen to the other undecided woman, Linda. Talk about the taxes and what it means and where things are at. Oh, and you can see from our NBC Wall Street Journal poll, the reaction to this is 36% of the American public have a more negative opinion because of Mitt Romney refusing to release his taxes.
Yeah, this is like what I'm talking about. It's like, what is the big deal? Just show him your taxes. It's like he's not forthcoming, you know,
It's
and
like
so
he's
you
hiding
don't
something.
know
Right.
anything about him. And why? What are you hiding?
That he's like hiding something. And I mean, I understand their personal life is their personal life, and I kind of care about what goes on because then that's how they do everything else. But if he's made all these billions and billions of dollars because of tax loopholes that he's managed to walk around or work around or find an edge for, is he going to do that for the rest of us who are sitting there working from paycheck to paycheck, who've lost their home because, you know, problems happen and they had to take out a second mortgage to get their head above water, and oh look, now I've lost everything? They need to kind of look at all that too. A lot of us, you know, I don't know how long it took Obama to pay off law school. I don't know how Romney made his billions and billions of dollars that he has, but they all need to start walking in everybody else's shoes. Not, you know, the millionaires who have prize horses that run in the Olympics because they can afford, you know, this $80,000 mare and run it all over the country and all over the world to get it to where it needs to go. They need to worry about how someone's going to put milk on their table, or how they're going to, you know, pay for a mammogram, or you know, when people's lives fall apart, how are they going to fix that or create like a little cushion? Because I think a lot of the world feels like we're walking on marbles, and everyone's wondering which marble are they going to hit before they're skating down the road, and they're on their backs going, okay, how'd this happen?
Michelle, same question.
I think it's kind of scary along the lines she was saying is, you know, him doing this and being secretive about it. You know, what's he going to do when he gets into office? I don't know. I just think that doesn't show what we need as a president, to not be open and honest about stuff. If you have nothing to hide, I mean, I don't care how much he makes a year, but if you have nothing to hide and you did everything legally, like you want everybody else to do it legally, show us that and prove it that you did it legally.
And that's what the challenge is right now. Americans are trying to answer three simple questions. Who do I like? Who's going to get America moving again? And who can I trust? And you look at this, for the American public, some 60 days out, there are still many more question marks than exclamation points at this stage of the game. And with that, I turn back to you. Thank you very much.
Peter, thank you very much. That was fascinating, and there's a lot there that we're going to talk about up here on the stage. And if you have questions that have come out of what Peter was talking about, or any of the issues that we bring up here over the course of the next half hour, keep them in mind. We'll be taking questions from the audience in about 30 minutes or so. But before I bring in my other panelists, I want to speak to Stan Greenberg, who has just come up with a book, It's the Middle Class Stupid. Not It's the Economy Stupid, but It's the Middle Class Stupid. Stan, kind of the middle class in America is a bit like, you know, apple pie and motherhood. It's one of those things everybody loves and everybody subscribes to. Why release a book on the erosion of the middle class during this election cycle?
Okay. And you're right to ask that question. And in fact, in a meeting that I had with one of the international parties this morning, people asked the question, are you saying that the middle class is stupid? Is that what the title means? That the voter, you know, ought to get how much Barack Obama has done and ought to therefore, get over it and vote for his re-election. I mean, the title is, you know, with the same compelling idea that we had with Bill Clinton when we did that campaign, It's the Economy Stupid, was that when you, and it has to do with also how campaigns run. We ran on the economy stupid. If you run a campaign that's on the economy, that's your mandate. That's everybody presumes when the election is over. That's what you're going to be addressing afterward. His first State of the Union joint session was totally on the economy. Didn't talk about any other aspect of the State of the Union, only the economy. What this book is arguing is that if you look at what's happened to America over the past 3 decades, but also if you look at our politics, that the way, you know, the only way you're going to address the central problems facing the country if you make the middle class central, they're central to our politics, they're central to the policies that you're trying to achieve. And though the title is middle class, it's middle class in an American sense. We're not, when we use middle class, 60% self-identify in the country as middle class. Even now, where it's come down, but it's still 60% now. We even have a more, expansive view, as does the president. The president talks about under 250,000, income. We think of it as people who work hard, expect that they're going to have rising prosperity in their life, pass that on to the next generation. Education is going to matter, and then all that will translate into American dream-like things. And what this book does is say that it's not real. Middle-class dream is not lost, but it's been a drop from almost 3/4 to almost half who think that American dream will be real for their children. We know incomes have not risen, barely risen in 3 decades. We know about the rising inequality, loss of wealth, and one of the really core findings in the book, and it comes from listening to people. I mean, some of the methodology is the same methodology that we're talking about here with focus groups. But we've done now through the 3 years from early in 2010, beyond that, we've been doing focus groups, in-depth interviews, monthly tracking of micro-level economic indicators, tracking the president's State of the Union speeches on what he's saying on the economy and how people react to it, and been doing very complicated web tests to test narratives, and I'll get to that, the narratives that can impact the election. And what we found, what the real hardcore of this is that this is really tough, and it's not just the recovery. In fact, it's almost not the recovery. And the elites and the administration, understandably, and the President of the United States, and Mitt Romney as a candidate, and the Republican Party and their kind of official candidacy are focused on how did President Obama respond to the crisis? Did he help or hurt? Did he bring the country back? Are you better off? That's not where the voters are. And where the voters are is that I was in trouble before the crisis. I've been losing income for a long time. American jobs have been going for a long time. American indebtedness, both their own debt and the country's debt, has been growing for a long time. And it's getting worse now. And as far as they can see, it's going to continue to get worse. So that we have an elite focused on 200,000 jobs each month. Is that a sufficient recovery? They're saying you're not talking to the real problems. And they're totally sophisticated. They understand what produced it. If you ask in our polls right now, who's responsible for the economy, the economic problems? Who's responsible for the deficit? Overwhelmingly, I'm sure in all our polls, they say George Bush, not Barack Obama. They don't want the candidates whining about that. They want to know what you're going to do about it. And so a lot of this book is about, is getting to a middle-class narrative, getting to a narrative that is about having a rising prosperity. It's making inequality much more central to the narrative. And, if you looked at the president's initial focus in this, not initial, through at least 3 years, maybe 3.5 years, he's been trying to make the case that we're making progress. He has metaphors which he varies at different times. His metaphor is they drove the car into the ditch. We got the car out of the ditch. By the way, when I speak abroad on this subject, the people are in trouble. I mean, they are really in trouble. I mean, there's statistically we know 40% loss of wealth, increased debt, loss of income. The new jobs that people now get after unemployment are pay 20% less than before. They are they're struggling with money. There's real pain. You can see it in the focus groups. But when I speak abroad and talk about 2% GDP growth as our kind of low point expectation and 8% unemployment, when I speak in Spain and Italy and other places, there's a kind of bemused, we'll take it. We'll take it. We'll take 2% and 8%. But that's, people are living in an American context, and their context is they're facing, and this is real, declining income and wealth, lost generational mobility, rising inequality, gap between productivity gains and income gains. And there's a powerful narrative that's centered on the future. The more the president talked about progress, he would go out every month, every time there was a 200,000 person job report, and they'd almost attack the moderator. Probably happened to you. We would do the exercise. They would attack the moderator. What kind of jobs are those? What do they pay? They're minimum wage jobs. There's no health care benefits. There's just don't they understand how much underwater and how the money I'm getting now doesn't get me out of debt. They're in deep trouble. So when they see the 200,000 jobs, what they heard was a president trying to claim credit for progress. They don't believe in it. They want to know what he's going to do long term. That includes debt. I mean, debt is a problem they want to address. And austerity is actually, as a policy, quite popular as a policy. I have not yet been able to beat them out of it. We're beginning to win that argument in Britain, but not here. But what this book is, and I'll stop with this. We look at the president's narrative historically, and we polled during the whole period of time when he was trying to make the case for progress, and was embedded in a recovery narrative, and with a metaphor about getting the car out of the ditch. Just always lost ground, and was in trouble until he moved to a narrative that was focused on the middle-class future. We actually tested along the way a range of narratives. They were very happy with a very minimal narrative that simply said, here's the plan. We did this. We're now at this chapter, and this is what we're doing next. Just tell us where we are and where we're going. Because they have no idea what the president's economic policy is. He's mainly been trying to say success up until now, and they have no idea what the philosophy, content, story, what the end is. Now, the president has moved dramatically over the last 6 months to saying this election is about the future of the middle class. It's not about the last 4 years. It's fine. We'll defend that, but it's really different choices about what we're going to do for the future, and whether you're going to recreate America with an aspiration for a middle class.
And Greenberg, the book is It's the Middle Class Stupid. It is, there are certain myths about America that are perpetuated in America during political cycles, and one of them is that there is more social mobility in America than there is anywhere else. In fact, of course, as you point out in the book, this is not the case. There is more social mobility in Europe now than there is in America, but trying to get people to respond to the big changes in demographics in the country and the big changing economy in America is one of the underlying parts of this election campaign. Okay, let's talk about these new frontiers in polling. I bumped into Andy Cohen, who was going to join us over the weekend, and I said, we're doing this panel, I'm so glad I'm going to see you down in Charlotte, as we said he couldn't make it, and he said, yeah, it's great, isn't it? You're going to be doing a panel on the new frontiers in polling with 4 white men who are over the age of 50.
Now Cohen.
John, you're excluded.
Still no wristwatch.
Whit, Ayres, let me start with you. What are the new frontiers in polling?
Thank you, Katty. Thank you for the opportunity to be here with you. Could I take just a moment
to say you're under 40.
Comment on the perspective on this election that Peter and Stan have mentioned. I agree with a lot of what both of them have said. Peter mentioned some focus groups we did out in the Midwest 2 weeks ago. And you have to sit in those focus groups to appreciate the extent to which American voters are scared. They're scared. Almost everybody in that group had lost a job, they had a family member who'd lost a job, or they were working at a job that paid them less. And what that meant was that they were really fearful, even if they were working, about this economy and what it meant for them and their family and their children. And people react differently politically when they're scared. The best analogy I can think of is if you got a life-threatening diagnosis for one of your precious children. Maybe it's a brain tumor or cancer, and you have to pick a surgeon that's going to operate on your child. And we do a focus group of people saying, how are you going to pick a new surgeon here? How are you going to pick the surgeon that's going to try to save your kid's life? And we ask them questions like we all ask. Which one of these surgeons would you rather go to a ball game with? Which one of these surgeons would you rather have as your next door neighbor? And they look at you like you're nuts. They say, why are you even asking me these questions? The only thing I care about is which one of these surgeons can save my precious child's life. That's the way American voters are thinking right now. Which one of these guys can fix this economy? Which one of these guys can ensure that my kid is going to have a job and not move back in with me? Which one of these guys is going to turn this thing around? And all these other questions are not just secondary, they're irrelevant. Barack Obama has very poor ratings on handling the economy. Mitt Romney is favored now on who's better at handling the economy. And the story of this election was in Peter Hart's graph up here on economic confidence. The presidents who won, Clinton, Reagan, and Bush 43, were above the line. And the presidents who lost, Carter and Bush 41, were below the line. Barack Obama is below the line right now. And that is the story of this election as it sits today. And that's why I believe if the election were held today, that Mitt Romney would win and Barack Obama would lose because of that graph that Peter showed. And Peter wants a rebuttal here.
You bet. Let me make a point.
Okay, Peter, I'm going to give you a brief rebuttal, and then I want to bring John into the conversation.
I want John into this conversation. Let me just make a brief rebuttal. It's great to suggest that it's a surgeon. The difficulty in all of this is one simple thing. We care about the human being that is going to be the President of the United States. And what I've said is, you nominate a stiff, you end up losing. And if you don't think so, take a look at Michael Dukakis in 1988, when he was running with the most favorable atmosphere that you could have as a Democrat. Take a look at John Kerry, 2004, and Mitt Romney is going to complete the trifecta of Massachusetts leaders who essentially are anything but this. So I would love to say it's nothing more than a surgical operation and nothing else counts. Whit, you believe that?
Okay,
You're going to be wrong.
Hold on a second, John. We've got here, I should remind you in the audience, we have here, of course, two Democratic pollsters, one Republican pollster. John is from a polling organization from the Washington Post, so he can be our referee on all of this. John, I mean, you know, I'm tempted to say they're both right?
Of course they are.
That this is a particular time in the American economy where things are looking so dire that the economic situation has a huge influence on how voters are feeling. And by rights, just looking at the economic numbers, Barack Obama should be nowhere near where he is. He should not be running neck and neck with Mitt Romney at the moment.
That's right, and Whit is absolutely right that the president has overwhelmingly, and has had for more than a year, overwhelmingly negative numbers on handling the economy. And we always look at intensity, you know, kind of not only do they approve or disapprove of how he's handling an issue, but do they feel that way strongly. And the intensely negative views of his handling of the economy have, for more than 2 years, outpaced the strongly positive ones by more than 2 to 1. That creates an inherent vulnerability on what is overwhelmingly and uncontroversially the #1 issue facing the country. The challenges for Mitt Romney on this score, and I should also say that he does, in fact, in our polling, as in Whit's, Mitt Romney has an advantage over President Obama when it comes to handling this issue. It's a 7-point lead among registered voters in our poll that we completed just before the Republican convention. Obama counters with a exactly equivalent 7-point advantage when it comes to understanding the economic problems that people are having in this country. And that has an issue in how, that plays a role in how people are processing these issues.
Okay, so as a pollster, how do you measure which of those numbers is the more important?
Well, they all go into the soup, that we're tasting and kind of trying to divine what's going on. I think, Peter laid out a framework for understanding this election. A tripartite one. One of those issues was about economic stewardship. And while there are overwhelmingly negative ratings on how President Obama has done so far, there isn't a great deal of confidence in how Mitt Romney would do, whether the economy would get back on track in a Romney administration. There isn't a lot of confidence, among the general public and among voters about Obama's ability in a second term to do it. That creates a great opportunity, has created a great opportunity for these conventions for Democrats and Republicans to define their candidates and about what would happen over the next 4 years, as Stan was talking about, kind of focusing those issues. But, you look at other issues, mentioned the issue of the deficit. Romney's single biggest advantage over President Obama is when it comes to dealing with the burgeoning federal budget deficit. Obama counters with the advantage on empathy, on likability, which was the first point of Peter's framework. And now they're even on taxes, which, as you pointed out yesterday, is remarkable. But on likability and just being a friendly person, Obama's advantage is more than 30 points. And that is a challenge, as Whit points out. It's not everything, and it may be much less than it usually is in deciding things. In '96, Clinton had a similar advantage when it came to bringing the more friendly and likable candidate, and obviously he won, but there were lots of other factors, as Peter put up as well. I do want to say, we talk a lot about kind of decision-making. A lot of the decision-making for many voters in this country is already completed. They can tell us certain things in polls or in focus groups, but there is a tremendous amount of partisan lock-in, and I think that we have to acknowledge that from the get-go. We're talking about we can debate the number of truly persuadable voters in this country, but overwhelmingly Democrats will vote for Barack Obama and Joe Biden, and overwhelmingly Republicans, self-identified Republicans, will vote for Mitt Romney and Paul Ryan. And that if we want to talk about new frontiers of polling, a lot of it is getting at that dynamic and understanding how much lock-in there is and kind of what is going on in the middle. And we can talk a lot about that.
Yeah, well, we'll get a little bit more into the 2012 campaign in just a minute, but Whit, let me get back to the original question that I asked you that you didn't answer on this idea of new frontiers of polling. What is changing in polling? What are the things that pollsters are looking for today in American elections that perhaps you weren't looking for 10 years ago?
Well, there are a number of things that have changed. One of the most important is cell phone only. Robocalls, the automated calls, are not allowed to call cell phones. And so now we have an increasing proportion of American voters who just use a cell phone. I'm one of them. I no longer have a landline. So every poll that we do includes cell phone samples. And that's an increasingly important part of it. So capturing that is important. People who don't want to talk to you on the phone is a huge problem, and it's going to get greater. We may be in a transition now from telephone to internet data collection, similar to what we were in the 60s, from door-to-door to telephone data collection. 10 years from now, I think a lot of us will be gathering more and more data over the internet, although it has its own challenges with randomness. But dealing with cell phones and dealing with non-response and the difficulty of making the transition to the internet are three big challenges that all of us face.
Wait, 1 second. Can I just ask you to put your microphone onto your lapel because it's rustling, and the television producer in me is getting nervous. Okay. Stan, particularly on this point of who you're trying to poll, because we all know that America is becoming more polarized. There are fewer and fewer people left who actually haven't made their minds up. How do you get to those people? How do you know, how do you really find the people who are worth polling? If what John says is true, that it's barely worth you polling, right? Whole groups of Democrats and whole groups of Republicans.
Right. And we have one-third cell phones. We also now begin interviewing on the weekend, because people are more likely to do an interview in a cell phone on the weekend, so it changes when you conduct interviews. The other piece that I mentioned earlier is is web format, because the samples and this relates to your question about swing voters, because there aren't a lot of swing voters. There are a lot of voters that could engage or disengage. It's much, different than Europe, where you're much more likely to have sustained, high turnout. Here, there's a very big difference between each presidential election we're, looking at. And if you want to know what's the big thing outstanding, it has to do with kind of the new kind of base, Obama base of the Democratic Party. It started before Obama. But it's young people, it's African Americans, Latino voters, unmarried women, remembering that half the country is unmarried, and that trend grows. Half the new births are non-white. I mean, there's a change in the country. And if you look at the Obama base, most of the groups I just mentioned, Obama got about 70%, almost 70% of the vote in the 2008 election. So if you want to know who's out there, those voters have both not engaged at the same level as 2008, but they've also not supported Obama at the same level. There's still a lot of convincing to do on young voters and unmarried women who together are about half the electorate. So I'm not looking at a target that's a sliver of 3 or 4%. There are big swaths of the electorate that are at issue here. And it's
so so you're trying to poll as many people as you can, not just swing voters, is what you're saying.
You can get them. I mean, I'm focusing on experiments with web tests, so that I will. If you look at the way we're coming at this issue, for me, the most important thing is the narrative, the frame. What's the election about? Okay, Mitt Romney wants this election to be about performance over the last 4 years. Are you better off? It's a past judgment. Do not give him another 4 years. And when the president was saying that tough decisions, we're starting to make progress, give me a chance to finish the job, we got killed. We got killed in 2010 in the off-year elections, and up until the president began to move to a different posture, that is a losing election. What the question is matters. So when we do it in web tests, so we may do 5,000 interviews, web tests, where we're able have 1,000 interviews, because you can afford to do it with web. You can have 1,000 interviews totally within a narrative. So you have a scenario where you play out the entire presidential election with Obama running on saying there's progress, and then we play out what Romney's saying, et cetera, and we look at the end of it, what we've shifted, what we've changed. So it's going to the question of this, swing voters. Or I can have a separate 1,000 interviews just within a middle class, it's the middle class stupid narrative about the middle class future. Don't care about what happened in the last 4 years. It's only what you're going to do in the next 4, and then we win within that. But you could not do that unless you had the ability to do those massive number of interviews, and you can do it with video. It's not just testing text messaging. We're now testing, spokespeople and economists, and which ones have the biggest impact, on the vote and who you trust on the economy.
Katty, can I mention one new frontier in third world countries? I know we have a lot of people here who are not from America, and polling in third world countries has been exceedingly difficult for many years. I've done some polling with the International Republican Institute in Cambodia. I wasn't used to having, as part of the polling budget, rental of the boat to go up the river to go to the village to talk to people, but that's what you do in Cambodia. I was recently in Kenya with the One campaign, the Bono anti-AIDS, anti-malaria campaign, and we walked down a long lane to this little village where there were thatched huts with dirt floors, no electricity, no running water. They still carried water from the river a mile away. And I'm thinking, these people are living exactly the same way they did 5,000 years ago. And the guy's cell phone rang. And he picked it up and talked on the cell phone, which he recharged with his car battery. And the thought hit me, I could do a survey of Kenya with cell phones. And the wireless revolution has leapfrogged, in many ways, centuries of technology. And there are all kinds of possibilities for doing polling with cell phones only in a lot of these third world countries that we never had before.
Peter.
I want to make a quick point, which is an opposite point. And you stop and you look. And one of the great things about our polling is how instantaneous we can get information. There's a downside to that. I mean, I can remember back when I started with Abraham Lincoln, it took a lot longer to get information. But essentially, I can remember in 1964, Khrushchev was deposed, there was a scandal in the White House, and Red China set off an H-bomb. And those three events happened right in the middle of the presidential campaign. The pollster I was working for was Lou Harris. He rushed out and did an absolutely instant poll, and it took him 7 days to get the information. That was instant. And the problem is today we're doing just the opposite. We are measuring things more quickly than the opinions have settled. So what will happen is Thursday night, after Obama's last sentence, somebody will be out there and we will test something, and we will then rush to the American public and the public at large and tell them, here's where opinion is. No, it isn't. Essentially, it's at the end of an earthquake to say, do you feel rumbling in your household? And the fact of the matter is, you have to let opinion settle. And a lot of cases, what we're doing is just the opposite and giving people a false sense of impressions of where things are at, rather than a sense of where they're truly balanced and they're there.
I mean, it sometimes feels, as somebody who's covering the campaign, that there are so many polls that the race is perhaps, it looks more volatile than it might be, perhaps because of what you're suggesting, that things are coming out so fast.
Perhaps it's also become so easy to collect data, and some of, organizations have low standards.
Are you suggesting we're polling too much? Because you might do yourself out of a job at this point.
These guys are polling way too much.
Going on.
We're doing just the right amount.
I think that one of the things that appeals to me about this industry is that there's technological change, and people have mentioned the different eras of door-to-door and mail surveys and the telephone surveys, and now cell phones. None of us on this stage was, I believe, doing regular cell phone surveys even 4 years ago. We did periodic ones, but every single poll now includes a sample of cell phone-only adults. You have to get a reliable sample of all Americans, and including registered voters now. And Whit mentioned, one of the problematic things, the most prolific pollsters that are out there are doing these, automated methodologies that by law are barred from calling, now a third of all American households. That can be problematic. You can model your way out of that, but you're just not reaching a large number of people, and so you have a large non-response, problem. But just because we've been able to solve the known problem with cell phones by calling them at great expense, but and 10 years from now, I totally agree with Whit that we will be collecting things over the internet, but that's not now. There is no reliable sample that we can turn to get a sense of the general electorate. We can do great message testing along the lines of what Stan's talking about, but in terms of getting a representative view of where the American electorate is, there is one way. It happens to be expensive, and media organizations tend to not be investing as they once were, and so you have kind of the proliferation of easy, cheap, data that don't necessarily stand up to the same test as others. In addition to the problem that Peter mentioned, just data that don't really mean anything, or movements that may not be meaningful unless you wait a week.
Okay, John, for the audience here, many of whom have come to watch this election from abroad, what polls should they pay attention to and when?
The Washington Post poll, right?
Oh, sure. The Washington Post, ABC.
It's a
the question. I suppose the question is, when should they start thinking to themselves, right? These polls are actually going to tell me what is happening in the American election. And
people want polls for different reasons. A lot of them want to know who's going to win, and I try to shy away from that. Certainly in my reporting on these polls. Polls are, you always hear, a snapshot in time, and the best of them, including all the three up here, kind of do really deep analyses on polls. They don't just ask a single horse race question. You're asking 40, 50 questions sometimes. Interrupting people during dinner, but people are still willing to do that for the right reasons and to get their voices heard. And it provides real context and analysis, and it tells the story, as Stan's saying. What's the narrative here? What's going on? And I think you can get that at any point in time. If you're just looking for who's going to win on November 6th, I would wait pretty much until November 5th. Or, the last week, there's always a convergence at the end, but, I've never looked at these for their predictive power. I know others do. I look at them for their explanatory power and the depth that we can come by just asking people what they think and how they're processing these issues, just as Peter was showing those focus groups. It's really fascinating to see how people are understanding these issues and talking about them. Focus groups give them more free-form way of doing that. But polls, kind of provide some structure to that as well, and it's very helpful. So I would look at them now. I don't look, I do look at specific branded polls, but what I'm mainly looking for in communicating to the readers of the Washington Post, and thank you for those of you who do continue to read printed newspapers, but we're online too, so you can catch us there, is communicate. It's all about the methodology. I don't judge polls by their outputs about who's ahead, who's up on one issue or another, but by what went into it. Did they include cell phones in their sample? How, kind of representative of whatever population they're saying they cover, do they actually cover? And that can vary a lot, particularly in international polls, where a lot of what's produced, at least published in this country, from polls overseas, are urban-only samples, with very low coverage rates. And those could be useful for certain questions, but, I can't present to the readers of the Washington Post a poll conducted in China that may represent 3% of the Chinese population. That may be a very important 3% of the Chinese population, but I'm not going to present it as a poll of all what Chinese adults think.
You talked about all the information and how you get it to make up your polls. You, Peter, and Stan have all worked on political campaigns.
Yes.
What do campaigns do with all of the information you feed them?
Exactly what we suggest.
Always exactly what you tell them to do.
Right.
Campaigns use polling data in an enormous variety of ways. Obviously, they want to know who's ahead and who's behind, but that's among the least important measures early on in a campaign. They use it to figure out what's important to voters and what's not important. They use it to figure out what messages resonate with voters and which ones don't. They use it to make strategic decisions. For example, I did Bill Frist's race, the Tennessee surgeon, back when he ran in 1994. Bill was 41 at the time. Bill had done a lot of great things in medicine. One of the things he hadn't done a lot of was vote. He never voted until he was 35 years old. And his opponent was pounding him for not voting until he was 35 years old. And the question was, do we put an ad on the air explaining that he was flitting about the world, going to London and going over here and learning to be a surgeon?
Never go around the world in American elections. Very bad idea.
And we just asked a simple question in a survey, are you aware of the fact that Bill Frist had not voted until he was 35 years old? And then we took the people who said they were aware of that. They were more likely to vote for him than the people who didn't know that. Why? Because they knew more about him. They knew he was a world-leading heart-lung transplant surgeon. They had an enormous amount more information about him. They didn't like the fact that he hadn't voted, but it wasn't disqualifying. So we did not put an ad on the air rebutting that. We stayed with our positive ads. It was the right strategic call, but you would never have made that call if you just listened to all the campaign's friends and advisors who were going, he's killing you with that. You got to put an ad on the air.
Stan, have you ever presented information to a candidate based on your polling that they have then totally ignored and been wrong?
Tony Blair.
Very interesting. Why? What was the information and how did he not use it?
And I can talk about this because I wrote about it in the book and with his cooperation. So that I polled for Tony Blair through 3 general elections. But he reached a point in which there was a breakdown of trust. The Iraq War was a central piece of that. His relationship with George Bush was a central piece of that. There was an internal debate on how to get heard, how to restore trust to be able to then make the case for why another labor term. Our data showed that voters needed an acknowledgement of learning from, he wasn't going to apologize, for the Iraq War, for relationship with George Bush, but, and I would pose the question, have you learned anything that one would acknowledge, in this process? And voters are unbelievably permissive, I think. They give a lot of space to a leader who says, I learned something from this, and it seems unimaginable, but they will give them another shot. We needed something around the Iraq War, something around George Bush, and we tested ways to do it. It was effective.
You tested it through focus groups. You went to focus.
No, we did polls in which we tested, not doing acknowledgement of learning from what had happened in Iraq in relation with George Bush, and then in the other part of the poll, testing our message without that. There was a decisive difference when you acknowledged learning, but he wasn't willing to do it. And I watched the conference speech and I waited to see whether he would do it, and no.
Did you have
there was not going to be any gap between where he was and President Bush and the United States.
Peter, this gets us to something that's relevant in this election campaign that just came up last week during the Republican convention in Tampa. And the New Jersey Governor, Chris Christie, gave the keynote address on the Tuesday night. And in that keynote address, he said, and I think I'm right in saying it was Christie, he said, a great leader is somebody who leads polls, not somebody who follows polls. How often does that actually happen? I mean, getting back to what Stan was just talking about there and Tony Blair. I mean,
it's a
really interesting question of leadership.
Great question. And right here in North Carolina, I worked for a governor that many people know and admire named Jim Hunt. He won re-election all the way back in 1980 with 71%. Ronald Reagan year, Democratic governor winning. He came to me right after the election and said, our roads are in lousy shape. I want to raise gas tax. And this is at a time the gas tax was going up. Don't come back and tell me people don't want to have the gas tax raised. I know that. Your job is to tell me how I sell it. And I came back and I showed him overwhelmingly the public was totally opposed to having the gas tax raised. But they cared about the safety, they cared about the economic growth of the country, of the state, they cared about a sense of where North Carolina would go. The governor went out there and he sold the gas tax, and he sold a 5-cent gas tax. And I had told him every downside that was involved. He took that political risk and he ran 3 years later for the United States Senate, and Jesse Helms beat him on the gas tax. And it was the fact that he knew what was important for North Carolina. He didn't want me to tell him that the gas tax wasn't popular. What he wanted to know is how to provide the leadership. He lost the race. 8 years later, he came back as the governor of North Carolina because the voters recognized that was a leader and it was somebody who was willing to look long term. I think that's what both Mitt Romney and Barack Obama have to do. Mitt Romney tried to do it in the Republican convention. It's now going to be up to Barack Obama to provide that sense of the guidance, the sense of where we're going to go. That's a leader.
Okay, we're going to take questions just 1 minute. I want to ask, first of all, John one question, because the Washington Post has a new poll out, which is people are talking about a lot here in Charlotte this morning. And it shows that Barack Obama is losing support amongst women. This has been traditionally in the course of this campaign, female voters have been strongly for President Obama, and the Republicans have tried very hard during their convention last week in Tampa to reach out to female voters. Now the Washington Post has a poll that is causing a lot of news here in Charlotte this morning. Tell us about it, John.
So this is a weekly check-in we do on basic favorability. Peter mentioned the importance of just the likability factor. And from the beginning of this campaign, Obama has had an advantage over Romney when it comes to being the more likable, having higher favorable ratings. And that's still true in this poll today, both among all adults and among registered voters, although by a smaller margin than we've seen in previous polls. And his status among women is surprised. We had a more detailed deep dive Washington Post ABC News poll before the GOP convention where we talked about the trust issues. One of the biggest...
By deep dive, you mean you ask more questions?
Lots of questions.
It's a bigger poll.
These are single questions, quick check-ins. And I'm going to say in a minute, a lot of what we saw in this poll was probably most likely because of the Republican convention. But when we did this larger poll a week ago, one of Obama's biggest advantages over Mitt Romney was on trust when it came to handling women's issues. So that's the kind of question that, before over-interpreting any small change in favorability, that I'd like to see how that plays out in the coming weeks now that both candidates will have had a chance to present messages. Obviously, they're focused on these in big ways, not only with Ann Romney's speech last week and Michelle Obama's last night, but more broadly. But to the particulars of this poll, what we saw and what we reported this morning in the Washington Post was a big increase in favorability for Mitt Romney among Republican women. We have a parallel decrease in favorability among Republican women for President Obama. Among Democratic women, 85% currently have favorable views of the president. That's identical to what it was a week ago. So a lot of what we're seeing is, just the partisan, Sam mentioned engagement and disengagement, and disengaging that we've seen. And so a lot of what I see in this poll is Republican women now as critical of the president as Republican men have been for months. Right. And, that is likely to carry on, through the intense political campaign. It may not. Among independent female voters, the president's numbers were not great, but they were not great a week ago. There was a high point in early August that he was much better, and we talked in the green room earlier about kind of whether that was a period where Obama had a bigger advantage, and lots of polls actually showed one. That's clearly narrowed to this toss-up that Whit mentioned at the beginning. He needs a strong showing from female voters. This is the poll today is not a good sign for him, but I also would wait for a few weeks before really interpreting it.
Okay, let's take questions from the audience. I think there are standing microphones over there and over there, and if we could start with the lady in the orange dress. Hi.
Hi, my name is Allie. I'm a student at Winthrop University. I'm interested to hear everyone's opinion on survey non-response. And I'm asking about this because of research done by the Pew Research Center. They found that in 1997, I think the response rate by telephone surveys was about 36%, and now in 2012, I think it's about 9%. But they say that it's just as accurate with the use of weighting the data to match the demographics of the United States, and it's consistent with other major polls results. So I'm interested to hear your opinion on this.
Okay, just before we answer that, I'm going to ask John to answer that quite briefly. We want to make sure that our visitors from around the world who are here for the NDI Leadership Program have a chance to ask questions as well. So perhaps I'm going to ask local members of the audience to hold off on questions until our visitors have had a chance to do so. But John, go ahead.
It's a great question. Survey response rates have been declining. One of the things that cell phones has allowed us to do is reach into that population and improve those to some extent, although we have issues there, and we do check to make sure that people are not driving when we call them on their cell phones. But it's a big problem, but as Pew has done a great service to the survey industry by doing such detailed analyses of the people that they actually ultimately get, and then compare that to higher response rate surveys. And by and large, there are no biases that are introduced. Some of it is getting by with weighting. Another part of it is the 9% that we are contacting. And again, that's response rate. It's not cooperation rate. One big problem that Whit mentioned is just people answering their phones. Like, that's the biggest problem, and we have no control over that. We have some control over cooperation in terms of having a friendly introduction, a reliable source, getting cooperation, and the cooperation rates are much higher, so that's why it's a technological problem. But ultimately, it's about whether the samples you're getting accurately match the population that you're trying to talk about. And what we see in the Pew data is that overwhelmingly, certainly in all of the issues that we're talking about here, there is kind of limited or no response bias. They found some bias when it comes to people participating in their local communities. So, I wouldn't want to do a volunteering survey, for instance, without figuring out how can I adjust my numbers. But when it comes to voting, the same biases that go into, answering a telephone political survey go into actually turning out to vote. So we have no clear effect on our numbers, at least not yet, but it's certainly something that we watch closely, and I'd sure as heck like to be where they were 30 years ago in response rates than where we are now.
Okay, over there on the right-hand side, the gentleman.
David Lammy, Member of Parliament in the UK. To what extent does the panel think that the global conditions make it almost impossible for incumbents to win? I'm thinking of Gordon Brown in the UK, Sarkozy in France, in Spain, in Italy, in Greece. Just a mood to change because times are so tough. Can I just, a quick second question. The Republicans, if they lose this election, does the demography of a changing America mean that there will have to be deep, deep thinking about changes in policy for the Republican Party.
Okay, let me put the first part of that question to Stan and the second part to Whit.
Okay. And the question's right, and Gordon Brown is part of this, the pattern that we watch across all the OECD countries. Incumbents of left and right, I actually think, I would argue left has actually lost a bit more than right, but incumbents have taken a beating. The literature that I've looked at says you need to have about 4% GDP growth for an incumbent to maintain the vote share from the previous cycle. There's like almost nobody that has a 4% GDP growth, and the projection on Obama, with those models, was that he'd have about a 50-50 chance in a two-way vote of winning based on the drop from his 53% performance to here. But that was based on a higher GDP projection than we're really having. So the economic context is one that you would expect him to lose. I mean, that's as we've talked about. If you're focused on the economy and you think the economy is the main or only driver, it edges against. The reason why I would go with Peter's more complex model for how people vote in a presidential election. I mean, we haven't mentioned foreign policy, national security. Presidents of the United States are commanders-in-chief. It does matter. The fact that the president
has... It's a very different role from
but it's
what you're looking at from European either presidents
It's part of
or
their
prime
comfort
ministers.
level, and it's a significant advantage that he has in this piece. The other piece we didn't mention is the party ID advantage that Democrats have. If you look across the polls, we're looking at a 6 or 7 point advantage for Democrats right now in our polls, and the polls we did together with Whit for National Public Radio, which is pretty amazing. Usually the presidential vote and the party ID and what's the party advantage, as you get to the end, move together. So if you look to 2008, President Obama won by 7, and the Democrats' party ID advantage was 7. So one of the reasons why I think this thing doesn't necessarily trend toward the economy alone is that the partisan context around them is much more democratic than the actual presidential vote. And that's related to the demographic trends that you raised, and I'll let Whit address what happens if they don't win this, because the Democrats do reflect those overall trends in the country, and I'm sure there'll have to be some adjustment. I'm sure he won't acknowledge losing, but
pick up on the Republicans.
Sure. Win or lose, there will be some deep thinking going on among Republicans about how we remain competitive in the future. We did not flunk arithmetic. We can count. And as a result of that, we're going to be doing some deep thinking. In 1980, when Ronald Reagan was elected, 88% of the American electorate was white. In 2008, when Barack Obama was elected, 74% of the electorate was white. If we had the same demographics in 2008 that we had in 1980, John McCain would be president of the United States. We're not just talking about changes at the margins. We're talking about fundamentally different changes. And that's why it's so important for Republicans to highlight leaders like Marco Rubio of Florida, Brian Sandoval of Nevada, Susana Martinez of New Mexico. It is perfectly possible for Republicans to do much, much better, particularly among Hispanics and Asians, than we have done in the past. Right now, we've been able to forestall that by doing significantly better among whites without a college degree, blue-collar whites. Barack Obama got 40% of them in 2008. Right now, he's polling down in the low 30s. So we can sort of make up the problems with non-white voters by doing relatively better among blue-collar whites, but that's a temporary measure. Long-term, Republicans are going to have to do better among non-white Americans to remain competitive nationally.
Okay, question from over here on the left, the lady in the red, thank you.
Okay, merci madame. Nous sommes des francophones, mais je pense qu'il y a voilà, un problème d'interprétation, mais elle pourra m'aider peut-être. Je suis la députée Saran Séré Sérémé du Burkina Faso, présidente du caucus genre et vice-présidente du Parlement de la CEDEAO. J'aimerais vraiment féliciter ces débats interactifs parce que, évidemment, je vois que Les différents camps se retrouvent sur un plateau, débattent sans passion sur des problèmes d'intérêt général, surtout d'intérêt particulier pour la nation américaine. Et je suis venue pour m'imprégner de cet exemple et j'en suis fort impressionnée. J'aimerais d'abord comprendre, est-ce que la méthodologie que vous utilisez pour ces sondages, est-ce qu'elle est d'une fiabilité? Vous créez des groupes. Nous savons que dans des groupes, il y a des effets de groupe. Et quand il y a des effets de groupe, forcément, il y a des influences. Et quand il y a des influences, évidemment, cela biaise le résultat. Donc, est-ce que cette méthodologie peut être considérée comme vraiment fiable? Une personne peut être assise, ne pas penser la même chose, mais à force de voir les autres dire quelque chose, la personne en est influencée. Deuxièmement, la publication des sondages. Est-ce que la publication des sondages n'est pas une forme déguisée pour, disons, canaliser les points de vue et surtout l'électorat? Parce qu'à force de répéter un mensonge, comme dit un dicton, le mensonge devient vérité parfois. Et à force de répéter que X ou Y peut être favori, nous avons vu que les populations sont parfois vraiment impactées par les décisions ou par le taux des sondages qui sont dits. Je peux ne même pas vouloir voter pour X, mais à force de dire qu'il est favori, ben, je me dis comme il est gagnant, autant aller vers lui. Également, le système du sondage. Aux États-Unis, ici, j'aimerais qu'on me dise, est-ce que vous avez déjà fait un sondage sur votre système politique? Parce que vous avez un président qui est élu sur la base d'un programme par la majeure partie de la population ou des grands électeurs. Mais parfois, il n'arrive pas à mettre en œuvre ce programme à cause d'un congrès ou de politiciens pour des raisons politiciennes. Mais qu'en pensez-vous? Qu'est-ce que la population en pense? Est-ce qu'on peut me dire s'il y a déjà eu un sondage dans ce domaine pour, pourquoi pas, réviser? Parce que c'est ça aussi la démocratie. Nous sommes dans une quête permanente de révision.
Madame, merci.
De nos différents systèmes.
Je crois que ça fait déjà 3 questions. Je vais les poser là-bas et puis on va continuer. Ça vous va? Attendez un instant. Hein? Okay, so there are 3 questions there. I'm happy to translate briefly. One is on the reliability of focus groups, whether when you conduct a focus group, people are influenced by the person sitting next to them. So for Peter, for example, when you go up to Wisconsin and somebody says to you that it's going to be stormy, is everyone else in the room bound to say that it's stormy? And before I forget them. The other was on whether by the publication of polls, by your very nature, you're influencing the electorate. If people keep hearing that Mitt Romney's ahead, for example, in the polls, does that actually influence, do you think, decisions that voters make at the end? And the third question was, has there been polling on the system of American government? Because, sorry, the lady who is from the Burkina Faso parliament feels that there are questions about the efficacy of the American system of government, and is that polled as well? So, Peter, let's start on the reliability of focus groups.
Okay, first of all, I have to say that's the nicest outfit I've had from any questioner all year long.
Je peux terminer avec mes 2 dernières questions?
Madame, je vais vous laisser à 3 questions parce que nous avons plein de personnes qui veulent poser des questions. S'il y a du temps après, je vais revenir chez vous. Ça vous va? Parce que sinon, il n'y aura pas assez de temps pour les autres.
J'aimerais quand même connaître le sondage sur la politique étrangère des États-Unis. Qu'on puisse me dire aussi un point de vue là-dessus. Il en a parlé en bref parce que cela semble être un point pas trop essentiel. Et pourtant, vous êtes le leader du monde. Vous avez donc ce devoir divin qui a été donné aux États-Unis d'impacter. Et donc, j'aimerais connaître votre politique. Je vous remercie.
Merci.
Okay,
let's start on.
I will briefly answer the question on the focus group. And simply put, yes, there's always a certain influence, and in part, that's why you feel like an orchestra leader. You're looking for somebody who will not necessarily be the most polarizing person, but you're looking for the person who starts it off and you're getting a point of view. Secondly, we do something that's called freezing the respondents. And that is, we will say, write down a word that describes how you feel about the weather. That way, we get the word that they're thinking of versus something that they're reflecting on. There are any number of techniques that you do, but obviously it's an interactive process, and what you're looking for is not a single answer, but instead a collective sense of where the group is at.
Okay, Whit, on the does the publication of polls influence voters' preferences?
I have not seen any evidence that the publication of polls affects the way people think or the way people vote. John is in the media and does polling in the media, and I think we should hear him on this question as well.
I mean, I'm also a semi-political scientist by training, and I've never seen really good political science research showing this in any country, although some countries have taken the step of banning public opinion polls a certain period out before an election. I think that, so while there's no evidence of it, it is possible, although you can have different interpretations of what someone would do if their candidate were ahead. Would that mean that they would stay home because they think it's in the bag, the election's in the bag? Would they want to turn out, to bask in the victory? So they're different kind of, each voter would process that differently. I tend to think it would be a wash, which kind of is clear in the data. And my own personal bias is, obviously being a pollster, is that in the absence of polls, you just get punditry that's either based on private polling information or based on nothing. And so you still have people trying to say so-and-so is ahead, regardless of the scientific validity of the poll that's presented. So my bias is for doing more scientifically based polls and later in the campaigns and letting those kind of get out there into the flow of information as opposed to having people with the sense that they have small pockets of private information. That said, we don't poll right up into the election because, in part because of the big investment. It's about helping our reporters and our readers understand the storyline of the campaign, not winning, as my colleague from ABC News calls it, the horse race lottery at the very end.
Thank you very much. My name is Marietje Schaak. I'm a member of the European Parliament.
I can't hear you very well. If you could speak closer to the mic or a bit louder, that would be great.
Marietje Schaak, a member of the European Parliament. With more sophisticated polling and technological developments, I'm interested in what effect this has on politicians themselves. So on the one hand, we're watching polls, and it becomes very easy to be very calculating, to know exactly where the majority is. But, we all know that a democracy requires a balance between majority and minority voices. On the other hand, minorities, when well organized, can do an easy job at setting the agenda. Now, yesterday, all the speeches in the arena of the convention seemed very scripted, and I read this morning that every word and every phrase has been tested in focus groups. So my question is, what is the impact of all this polling on the quality of democracy? Do we still generate genuine leaders in politics, or is everyone becoming a follower?
It's a brilliant question.
Good question. I mean, it gets a little bit to what we were talking about earlier.
It's a brilliant question, and thank you very much for it. And I think we lose, obviously, something, because at this stage of the game, so much information is being processed, and campaigns are spending, as we can see, zillions of dollars in terms of where things are headed. And I think that what people are looking for is a sense of genuineness and a sense of authenticity. I think some of that authenticity has been wrung out by what we do and how well we do it. The other side of it is, I would tell you, the importance of public opinion is that it often provides what I would say is the information that leaders need to get to make tough decisions. And from that point of view, I look at two events in terms of my political lifetime, both in terms of Iraq and Vietnam, and add in Watergate. I think the public was far ahead of the politicians in terms of that. I think the understanding of that, I think the difficulty is we've gotten down to such micro levels at this stage of the game that we do lose some of the genuineness and the spontaneity which was there.
Real leaders still lead, though. In a democracy, government of the people, by the people, for the people, it's very important for the elected leaders to know what the people think. But I bet you every one of us has a good example like Stan did with Tony Blair, where we go in and say the politically popular thing to do would be A, and they say, I'm not doing A, I'm doing B, and I'm going to try to persuade people that B is correct. So I agree with Chris Christie. Real leaders don't follow polls, real leaders lead polls, but real leaders also know what the opinion is before they start to lead.
Right, there's a tension. I don't want to just jump on this bandwagon, and because there is some real learning here that I think advances leadership and democracy and the choice that you get in elections. I mean, I hate the part of this in which you have it, candidates or parties, looking for a silver bullet, looking for a word, looking, for an emotion that you can grab hold of. It's the most trivial part of what we do. But most leaders that we're working for have an agenda, have a history, have a biography, or vulnerable for a whole as a candidate on a whole range of things. So if you asked, and I think you asked how do campaigns use polling now, if you asked me what are polls right now in America in Senate races or races for Congress are doing, they would start by testing profiles of the candidate. So in effect testing different biographies of the candidate. Do I talk about my experience as a small business person? Do I talk about my experience as an activist, battling against the local oil refinery and the pollution? It's for sure the first thing you do is what part of my life matters here as I'm thinking of running. I think that's a totally legitimate thing to do. Now, you're not making up biography, but what part of one's life is relevant, particularly because of how obscene the campaign finance system is in America, given how much money you're putting behind ads, knowing which biography to talk about. And then similarly on attacks, in a poll you'll have, you'll test profiles, both of your candidate and of the opponent. And then you'll test themes for your campaign and message, but you'll also test a whole series of attacks on the candidate to get at which attack was most effective, and defining the election, going after your opponent on an issue, going after Romney on his taxes or Cayman Islands or whatever the issue would be. That is and that is central and is probably the dominant use of polling, in what we're doing. And I'm fine with that. My problem is the money. I have lots of examples. The predominant examples is leaders who know what they want to do, know what they've done, know what they would like to do if they led the country, and are testing how they get the strongest message built upon things that they've done usually over a lifetime. That's mostly what I'm dealing with, but there is around it a lot of inauthenticity.
Question.
Thank you. Mario Jaramillo, Ambassador of Panama. Even though I don't speak French, a lot of what I was going to ask, it was asked before by my colleague from Congo and by the parliament. But I just wanted to add or ask two things, and also to see if what is done in our countries and some countries that are here, what do you think about it? First, being from the marketing background, I know it's not only the sample, how you pick it, the time, but also how you ask the question. You can ask, depending on the answer you want, is how you ask the question. It's like when we were in grammar school that you said in the true and false test, whenever in the question it says always or never, always put false. So given that, I wanted to ask some questions of what we're doing and if you would be willing to do that in the States, and if it's done now. I'm talking about surveys, not for the political parties to do their strategy, but for the people to decide to vote. First, is there any institution, obviously with more credibility, who after the election evaluates which polls were close or which were real far off of what happened? Second, if when you come out with a poll, do you have to say how your sample was before so the people that read the poll can tell if the sample were 30-year-old college graduates, female from families who, whatever. And third, if there's any regulation on exit polls in the states, if you can be doing exit polls all day, and the regular poll, if you can do it up to the last day before the election, or do they say, you cannot pull out results of polls till 2 weeks before the election? Those are some of the things that at least we've been trying to better this system in our country and some countries, always through a Liberty Foundation for Liberty or some kind of these things. And I want to know if you have anything like that, or if you think that's infringing against free press or whatever.
Okay, very interesting. So a question there from Panama. Well, there are three quite technical questions. Is there any institution which evaluates which polls were more accurate than others after an election, John?
The closest thing there is to an institution is the NCPP, which is the National Council on Public Polls, which does a summary of the latest or closest to the election polls from a range of pollsters and does summaries of that. Of course, you know, there's a burgeoning crew of bloggers who, you know, kind of also evaluate by on different means the performance of polls, and you know, we all do it, you know, to some extent. But in terms of what is disclosed, I mean, it's one of the main things that I look for in terms of publishing polls, other polls in the Post. There's an effort underway at the American Association for Public Opinion Research called APOR, which is about transparency, and it's about setting the minimum disclosure standards for polls that are released into the public domain. A lot of what we've talked about here tonight, or are some about the public polls that we all do, but gentlemen on the stage also do some private polling for campaigns, and they're very different. You know, they're just different standards for what you release into the public domain and what you share with the candidate. And to the first question about, you know, question effects of how you word a particular question, absolutely it can make a big difference. And it's one reason why polls that are released into the public, there's an expectation that you release exactly the way that you ask the question and the questions in the order that the respondent, you know, kind of was asked them on the telephone or online. And so every poll that we do at the Washington Post, you know, every single question that we've asked with exactly the words that we used on the telephone is listed for people to criticize. And yes, in many cases it does make a difference, but I see the red light on, so I'll...
And Whit, you have already talked about how important it is that we know what the sample group is that's being tested. When you release a poll to the public, you release that sample group.
We release the exact wording of the questions, we release the order of the questions, and we release the composition of the sample, and we put right up front the proportion of Democrats, Republicans, and independents in the sample, because that is such a critical aspect of it. At Resurgent Republic, every question we've ever asked is online. Stan does the same thing with Democracy Corps. So you have got to give people the basic structure of the sample for them to be able to evaluate honestly and reliably the other questions that we tell them.
Okay, briefly, the final point there about exit polls before we wrap up.
Well, exit polls, I think, are similarly the single best polls available. Why? Because essentially people are telling you exactly what they did, and you can look at huge samples, so you can look at very microscopic groups. And secondly, there is, quote, no bias, because people do not know how things are coming out. It's what's happening at exact time. I've been involved in them since 1964. They provide fabulous data for all of us.
Invaluable.
But the problem with it is that if you look at the exit polls as they're coming in during the day of the election, they're always wrong, and they're a disaster.
That's Lucy holding the football.
Okay. But they are, because they're useful, because they're useful historically, they're useful after the fact, because what happens statistically is once you actually have the votes counted, they readjust the exit polls to reflect what happened in the actual vote. So you then, as a consequence of that weighting, have something that's reliable. The problem is, in many countries, the reason you're doing an exit poll is to see if the election is being held honestly, and so that you can't use the actual result, because that's what, in fact, you're trying to judge, whether that is a legitimate election or whether there's been tampering. So it's more challenging internationally.
The gentleman asked about restrictions on exit polls in this country, and so there's one main exit poll that a consortium of networks in the Associated Press now contribute to. There used to be more, but now there's just the one. Exit pollsters can't stand within a certain distance of the precinct, place where they've selected. And the other major restriction is the one based on 2004 and other instances of misreporting of early returns. That is that they're locked up until 5 p.m.
And on 2000, of course, when we changed as well the way we reported after Florida.
There have been many famous instances of misreading those numbers.
Now we're all careful. Peter Hart, John Cohen, Whit, Ayres, Stan Greenberg, thank you all very much for joining me, and thank you all for your questions.
Thank you.